He lay motionless in the snow for hours at a time, in temperatures that dropped below -40 degrees. He carried no scope, only iron sights, a wooden stock, and a patience most soldiers never learn. The Soviet Union sent an army of over 1 million men into Finland, certain that a country of 3.5 million people would surrender within 2 weeks. They did not expect a farmer. The Red Army called him Belaya Smert, the White Death. They sent counter-snipers to hunt him. They sent artillery to bury him under shattered trees and burning snow. They sent patrols with orders to bring him back alive. Every one of them failed. By the time the guns went silent, he had been credited with over 500 confirmed kills with a rifle alone, a number no sniper in modern warfare has ever matched. He never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He wanted to be remembered as a man who did his duty, and nothing more. This is the story of Simo Häyhä, and how one hunter from the Finnish woods became the deadliest soldier in the history of war. The farm sat 8 kilometers from the nearest town, in a stretch of Finland called Rautjärvi, close enough to the Russian border that the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Pine and spruce and white birch grew thick there, packed so tightly that sunlight fell to the ground in broken pieces. Snow covered everything from October to April, sometimes waist-deep, silencing footsteps and swallowing sound, until a man walking through it felt like the last living thing for miles. The soil beneath it was thin and stubborn, the kind that gave up rye and potatoes only if a man worked it without complaint. Winters came early and stayed late, and the cold was not the kind that visited. It moved in and settled, the way an unwelcome relative settles into a spare room and never quite leaves. Simo Häyhä was born on that farm on December 17, 1905, the second of 8 children in a family that measured its wealth in acres and cattle, not money. His father worked the land from before dawn until after dark. His mother ran a household that never had enough hands for the work that needed doing. Simo left school at 14, as most rural boys did, and went to work the fields full-time. There was nothing in his early life that suggested history would remember his name. Except for one thing, Simo hunted. From the age of 12, he moved through the forest with a rifle his father had given him, learning to read wind before he understood arithmetic, learning to sit without moving for hours before he understood patience as a word. He learned to control his own breathing until it barely disturbed the air in front of his face, to let his heartbeat slow into something steady and almost forgettable, to let cold settle into his limbs without letting it own him. He hunted fox and elk, and the occasional wolf that came too close to the cattle. He learned that an animal that senses you will run, and an animal that never senses you will die without knowing why. By the time he was 20, men in the district said there was no better hunter in the parish. He could drop a running fox at 400 meters. He could lie in snow so cold it froze breath to fabric, and not shiver, and not move, and wait, sometimes for so long that when he finally rose, his own joints ached with a stiffness that took an hour to walk off. In 1925, at the age of 20, Simo did what every young Finnish man did. He completed his compulsory military service. Finland had been independent from Russia for less than a decade, and the fear of what Russia might do next sat under every conversation like a stone under water, unseen but always there. Simo trained with the Civil Guard, a volunteer defense force built on the belief that war was not a possibility, but a certainty waiting for its date. His instructors noted his marksmanship immediately. At close range, he rarely missed. At 300 meters, he was among the best in his company. At 500 meters, a distance where most riflemen become guessing men, Simo still hit what he aimed at more often than not. He returned to the farm when his service ended. He hunted. He entered shooting competitions across the region, and he kept winning them, quietly, without celebration, the way he did most things. By 1939, he held a string of national titles. His competition rifle was a Finnish-made M2830, a refined version of the old Russian Mosin Nagant, built by Finnish gunsmiths who had improved the trigger, the sights, the stock, until the weapon felt less like a tool and more like an extension of the man holding it. He never used a telescopic sight. He said a scope forced a man to lift his head too high, and light could catch the lens and give away a position that iron sights would never betray. He was a small man by Finnish standards, barely over 5 feet 3 inches tall, quiet, unmarried, a man who did not drink and rarely spoke unless spoken to first. He attended the Lutheran church on Sundays. He was unremarkable in every way except one, and that one way was about to matter more than anything else in his life. On November 26, 1939, Soviet artillery shells fell near the Finnish border village of Mainila. Soviet officials claimed Finnish guns had fired first. It was a lie, constructed in advance, the kind of lie that governments tell when they have already decided what they intend to do. Joseph Stalin wanted Finnish territory near Leningrad. Finland had refused to give it. 4 days later, on November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded. The numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. The Red Army crossed the border with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a force that would grow past 1 million before the war ended, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft. Finland answered with roughly 300,000 men, most of them reservists and farmers pulled from fields and forests, armed with rifles their fathers might have carried. Finland had a small handful of aging tanks, little more than museum pieces, and a modest air force that could do almost nothing against Soviet numbers. Military analysts around the world expected the war to last 2 weeks. Some expected less. Simo received his mobilization orders on the day of the invasion. He reported to his Civil Guard unit and was assigned to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, a unit that would be sent north to a stretch of frozen river called Kola. It was 50 kilometers from the farm where he had grown up. If the Soviets crossed the Kola River, the road to Viipuri, Finland's second largest city, would lie open in front of them. If Viipuri fell, many believed the war itself would be lost. The forest at Kola was the same kind of forest Simo had hunted his entire life. Dense pine, deep snow, silence broken only by wind. His orders were simple in the way that orders during a war for survival are always simple. Hold the line. Stop anyone who tried to cross. The Soviet 155th Rifle Division attacked Kola in early December, throwing wave after wave of soldiers across the frozen river, in numbers meant to overwhelm through sheer weight of bodies. It was a doctrine built on the idea that casualties were an acceptable cost of victory. Finnish machine gunners and riflemen dug into the tree line, fired into the advancing lines, and did not stop firing. By the end of the first day, Soviet losses in that single sector numbered in the thousands. Finnish losses numbered in the dozens. The exchange was not close. It was not supposed to be possible. Simo fought in that first battle as an ordinary rifleman, among hundreds of others, firing when ordered, reloading, firing again. But something in him was already working differently than the men around him. He watched the way Soviet soldiers moved. He watched how they followed roads instead of forest, how they bunched together instead of spreading out, how they exposed themselves in ways that no hunter would ever allow an animal to expose itself. In the language he understood best, the Soviets were not disciplined soldiers to him. They were predictable prey, and predictable prey does not survive long against a man who has spent his whole life reading the forest. He asked his company commander for permission to operate as a marksman, working alone rather than shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the company. It was an unusual request, but the war itself was unusual, and the commander approved it. Simo would choose his own positions. He would decide when to fire and when to wait. His only restriction was to remain close enough to Finnish lines that he could return to them if needed. He began going out before dawn, alone, moving quietly into the no-man's land between the two armies, choosing a spot in the snow with the same care he had once used choosing a spot to wait for elk. He packed the snow around his body until only his rifle barrel and a narrow strip of his face remained uncovered. The cold at that hour had a particular quality to it, a stillness so complete that a man could hear his own blood moving if he listened closely enough. His breath came out in slow, measured clouds until he learned to hold even that back. He waited in cold that could kill an unprepared man in under an hour. His fingers grew numb inside his gloves, then past numb, into something closer to wood, and still he did not move. He waited the way he had always waited, without impatience, without doubt that the moment would eventually come. And in the first days of that new role, it came. A Soviet officer moved into view through the trees, organizing a patrol 250 meters away, unaware that anything in the silent forest around him could see him at all. Simo settled his breathing, the way he had done since he was a boy with a rifle too large for his hands. He waited for the pause between heartbeats that hunters learn to feel rather than count. Then he fired. The officer fell. The rest of the patrol scattered into the trees, confused, searching for a threat they could not locate, unable to understand that the man responsible was already still again, already invisible, already waiting for whichever one of them was foolish enough to come back and check on their fallen commander. One did. And by the time the sun set fully over Kola that day, the war had already begun to change the quiet farmer from Rautjärvi into something the Soviet Union had not accounted for when it drew its plans for a 2-week campaign. Something the men on the other side of that frozen river would soon learn to fear more than artillery, more than winter, more than the war itself. They did not yet have a name for him. That would come soon enough. For now he was simply a shape in the snow that killed and disappeared, over and over, and left no trace behind except the men he left in the woods. The name came before the Soviets understood what they were naming. Patrols returned from the forest missing men, and the survivors could offer almost nothing useful to their officers. They had heard a single shot. A comrade had fallen without a sound of warning, without a shape to blame, without so much as a flicker of muzzle flame in the trees. Sometimes a second shot followed the first, and a second man fell, and the rest scattered into cover that offered no real protection from a threat they could not locate. When interrogated, the survivors gave the same account again and again. No flash, no smoke, no warning. Just a man falling into the snow and a silence that followed it, heavier than before. One officer, questioning a soldier who had watched 2 friends die within the same minute, asked him to describe exactly what he had seen before the shots came. The soldier could offer almost nothing. He said the forest had looked the same as it always looked, white and gray and endless, and that nothing in it had moved before the first man fell. He said it felt less like combat and more like the woods themselves had decided to kill them, one at a time, without explanation. The officer wrote the account down because regulations required it, though privately he did not know what use such a report could possibly serve. There was no enemy position to mark on a map. There was only absence and the bodies it left behind. The forest did not care what either army believed about it. It simply held the same silence it had always held, broken now and then by wind moving through frozen branches, indifferent to the men on both sides who had come to fear it in different ways for different reasons. Soviet commanders began to speak of the Kola sector the way sailors speak of certain waters. Something lived there that could not be explained by ordinary warfare. The soldiers gave it a name that spread through the ranks faster than any official report could contain it. Belaya Smrt, the White Death. It was not, at first, believed to be one man. It seemed impossible that a single rifleman could account for so many dead in so short a time. So the assumption took hold that an entire unit of trained snipers was operating along the river, coordinated, patient, deadly. The idea of one farmer with an ordinary rifle achieving what looked like the work of a small army was, to most of the men facing him, simply too absurd to consider. Simo did nothing to correct the assumption, because Simo said almost nothing to anyone. He left the Finnish line before first light most mornings and returned after dark, and in between those hours he built a discipline that would come to define him more than any single kill. He never fired more than 3 rounds from a single position. 3 shots gave an enemy enough information to begin triangulating a location, and Simo had no intention of giving the Soviets that gift. After his third round, whether or not more targets remained in view, he withdrew 50 meters and began again, patient, unhurried, as though the war itself could wait for him to find a new vantage point. He learned to defeat the two things that gave snipers away in winter. The first was muzzle flash and the crack of a rifle firing above open ground. Simo fired from deep within snowdrifts, his barrel low, so that the blast of the shot dispersed into the snow around him, instead of flaring visibly into open air. The sound reached Soviet ears muffled and directionless, a report with no clear point of origin, as if the forest itself had fired the shot and then gone quiet again. The second was breath. At 40 degrees below freezing, a man's exhaled breath turned to visible vapor, a small pale flag rising above his position, easy to spot for anyone trained to look for it. Simo began holding snow in his mouth before he settled into position, letting it cool his breath before it left his body, so that nothing rose above the drift to betray him. It was a small thing. It was also the difference between living and dying, and Simo understood that in war, most of the differences that mattered were small. None of it was new to him. He had learned every part of it as a boy, kneeling in the same kind of snow with a rifle meant for a smaller animal than the ones he now hunted. An elk that caught your scent on the wind would be gone before you ever raised your rifle. A fox that saw your breath rise above a hedge line would vanish into brush faster than a man could blink. The forest had always punished carelessness the same way, whether the creature moving through it wore fur or wore a uniform. Simo had simply never stopped believing that lesson, even when the stakes around it changed from a winter's meat to a nation's survival. Men who had spent their whole lives in cities, trained in classrooms and drilled on parade grounds, arrived at the front already carrying habits the forest would not forgive. Simo had spent his whole life being forgiven by it, because he had never given it a reason not to be. His company commander noticed the change in him before anyone else did. Simo had always been quiet, but there was a different quality to his silence now, a stillness that seemed to extend past his body and into the way he thought. When asked once, briefly, how he managed to remain undetected for so many hours in temperatures that killed careless men, Simo answered with only a handful of words. You stop thinking of the cold as an enemy. It becomes part of the position. The commander did not fully understand what he meant until much later, and by then Simo had already gone back out into the trees. The Soviets did not accept defeat easily. In the second week of January, they sent specialized counter-sniper teams into the Kola sector, soldiers trained specifically to hunt other snipers, equipped with scoped rifles and the patience to match. They worked in pairs, one man watching, one man ready to fire the instant a target revealed itself. It was sound doctrine, built on years of study, and it had worked against snipers on other fronts in other wars. It did not work against Simo, because Simo did not behave the way a textbook sniper behaved. He did not stay in one place long enough to be studied. He did not reveal his muzzle. He did not breathe visibly into cold air. The counter-sniper teams watched empty snowdrifts for hours, convinced they had located his position, only to find nothing there when they finally moved to confirm it. They were hunting a man who had already spent 20 years learning how to become invisible to creatures far more alert than they were. More than once, a Soviet counter-sniper team settled into position close enough that Simo could hear the faint creak of their equipment shifting in the cold, close enough that a single mistake on his part would have ended everything in the space of a heartbeat. He did not panic in those moments. Panic was a luxury for men who had not spent their lives learning that the body betrays fear before the mind admits to feeling it. He controlled his breathing, held his position, and waited for the moment when the searching pair grew tired, or careless, or simply moved on to search a different stretch of tree line. Then, and only then, would he consider whether a shot was worth the risk of revealing himself at all. Most of the time, it was not. He let entire patrols pass unengaged rather than expose a position that might be more valuable the following day. Restraint, as much as marksmanship, kept him alive through that stretch of the war. The counter-snipers eventually began to doubt their own instruments. Reports circulated among Soviet officers suggesting the Finnish sniper along the Kola line might not be a single man at all, but a rotating handful of specialists, since no individual soldier, in the estimation of their training manuals, could reasonably sustain such consistent lethality alone, day after day, without eventually making the kind of mistake that gets a man killed. It was, in its own way, a kind of tribute, though none of the men writing those reports intended it as one. They simply could not accept that the discipline they were failing to match could belong to a single farmer with an unmodified rifle, and no formal military pedigree beyond a few years in a volunteer defense guard. When the counter-snipers failed, the artillery came. Soviet commanders reasoned that if a man could not be found, the ground beneath him could simply be destroyed instead. Howitzer crews bombarded stretches of forest where Finnish sniper activity had been reported, saturating the tree line with shell after shell until trunks splintered and snow turned black with dirt and smoke. On one occasion, an entire section of woods where Simo had been active was reduced to broken timber and churned earth within the space of half an hour. When Finnish scouts moved through the wreckage afterward, they found no trace of him there at all. He had watched the artillery being positioned from a distance earlier that morning, recognized the preparation for what it was, and relocated to safer ground well before the first shell landed. The bombardment achieved nothing except the destruction of an empty patch of forest, a cost in ammunition the Soviet Union could absorb far more easily than it could absorb the loss of confidence spreading through its own soldiers. Finnish soldiers who reached the site after the shelling stopped described it in later years as a place that no longer resembled a forest at all. Trees had been reduced to blackened stumps, and splinters driven into the snow like nails. The air still carried the acrid smell of spent explosive long after the guns had gone silent, and the ground beneath the snow had been churned into a mixture of frozen dirt, bark, and shrapnel that would not be cleared until the spring thaw finally arrived months later. It was the kind of destruction meant to erase any possibility of survival within its boundaries, and it had failed against a single man who understood, before the first shell ever landed, that the sound of preparation was itself a warning worth listening to. That loss of confidence was, in its own way, becoming its own kind of casualty. Soldiers who had once marched into Finland expecting an easy victory now dreaded assignment to the Kola line. Word passed between units, the way fear always passes between frightened men, quietly, insistently, impossible to fully suppress. Officers noted a decline in volunteers for forward patrols. Some men found reasons to delay. A few refused outright, choosing the certainty of punishment over the possibility, which had come to feel in their minds like a probability, of dying without ever seeing the one who killed them. It was a strange kind of warfare, one where a single rifleman could apply pressure to the morale of an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, simply by being impossible to find and impossible to stop. Officers responded the only way military discipline allowed them to respond. Men who hesitated were ordered forward regardless of hesitation. Refusal carried consequences far more certain than the uncertain danger waiting in the trees, and so soldiers who did not want to walk into that forest walked into it anyway, because the alternative offered by their own command was worse than anything the White Death might do to them. It was a grim kind of arithmetic, one repeated in different forms across every hard winter of every hard war, where the fear of one's own side became, in the end, more reliably enforced than the fear of the enemy. Some of those soldiers survived their patrols and returned with nothing to report. Others did not return at all, and their names were added to a growing list that no propaganda office in Moscow found any way to explain to the families waiting for word of them. Soviet command tried one further approach. If Simo could not be found by chance encounter and could not be destroyed by artillery, then perhaps he could be drawn into a trap set specifically for him. In late January, a small team of Soviet soldiers moved at night into the forest behind what they believed to be an unmonitored stretch near Finnish lines, and settled into position along a trail intersection that Finnish patrols were known to use. They waited through the freezing hours before dawn, rifles ready, certain that patience would finally succeed where speed and firepower had failed. Simo approached that same intersection in the early morning, moving with the unhurried care that had kept him alive through weeks of war. The forest at that hour held a particular kind of quiet, one he had learned to trust more than any sound. Snow muffled almost everything, but it could not muffle the absence of the small, ordinary noises a healthy forest makes on its own. The settling of branches under fresh snow, the distant call of a bird disturbed by nothing more than daylight. That morning, the quiet felt different. It felt occupied. Something in the stillness ahead felt wrong to him before he could have explained why. It was not a sound or a shape he could point to. It was the same instinct that had once told a younger version of himself, standing in these same woods with a boy's rifle, that an elk had sensed danger and would not walk into the clearing it was supposed to walk into. He stopped. He did not advance further along the expected path. Instead, he withdrew, circled wide through the trees, and approached the intersection again from an angle no one waiting in ambush would have anticipated. When he finally saw them, the Soviet soldiers were still facing the trail, watching for a target that was supposed to come from the direction they expected, their backs left exposed to the one direction they had not thought to guard. Simo fired before any of them understood the ambush had turned itself inside out. The men closest to him fell first. The others broke from position and fled through the trees, and by the time they reached safety, several of their number remained behind in the snow, victims of a plan built to kill a man who had simply refused to walk where he was expected to walk. February brought the coldest weather of the war, and with it, Simo's deadliest weeks. Soviet soldiers wore heavy winter uniforms in shades of brown and gray that stood out sharply against the endless white of the Finnish snow, visible at distances that would have hidden a more carefully dressed enemy. Simo extended his effective range to take advantage of it, engaging targets at distances that demanded exact judgment of bullet drop and wind, calculations that had become so deeply practiced in him that they no longer felt like calculation at all. They felt like instinct, the same instinct a farmer uses to judge whether rain is coming, arrived at through repetition rather than conscious thought. The cold that month was severe enough to kill men who made no mistakes at all, let alone men who spent hours motionless in snowdrifts, waiting for a shot that might never come. Frostbite crept into fingers and toes and the edges of exposed skin faster than most soldiers could recognize the early warning signs, and Simo was not immune to it simply because he was skilled. He returned from long watches with numbness that lingered for hours after he came back inside, with joints that ached in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what he demanded of his own body, in service of a single motionless hour after another. He rarely spoke of the physical cost. He treated frostbite and exhaustion the way he treated everything else that winter, as conditions to be managed rather than complaints to be voiced. There was a war to fight and a body that still functioned well enough to fight it, and for Simo that was reason enough to keep going back out into the trees each morning before the sun rose. His confirmed kills climbed through the winter at a pace that no military record from any prior conflict had produced. Officers on both sides of the line began to understand, slowly and with some reluctance on the Soviet side, that the destruction attributed to an entire phantom unit was in fact the work of one man, a farmer from a small village near the border, armed with an ordinary rifle and an extraordinary capacity for stillness. By the later weeks of February, his total had climbed toward a number that would, by the time the war ended, place him beyond any sniper in recorded military history, a distinction earned not through a single dramatic act, but through the accumulation of hundreds of small, disciplined, patient decisions, repeated day after day in conditions that killed careless men within hours. The Soviet Union did not stop searching for him. If anything, the search intensified as the weeks passed, drawing more resources, more specialized teams, more artillery, more attention from commanders who found it increasingly difficult to explain to their own superiors how one rifleman continued to evade an army built for continental war. Simo, for his part, did not think of himself as a legend in the making. He thought of himself as a man doing a job that needed doing, the way he had once thought of clearing a field or repairing a fence. The war had simply changed what the job required of him. Word of his growing reputation reached him only indirectly, filtered through the comments of fellow soldiers who had heard what the Soviets were calling him. He offered no reaction when told about the nickname, no pride, no discomfort, only a brief acknowledgement before returning to whatever task was in front of him, cleaning his rifle, checking his ammunition, resting before the next watch. One young soldier in his company, still new enough to the front to find the whole situation remarkable, once asked him directly whether it felt strange to be feared by an entire army. Simo considered the question for a moment before answering. He said that fear was simply a tool, the same as a rifle or a length of rope, useful only if it kept more of his own countrymen alive by the end of the day. Whether the Soviets called it White Death or anything else made no difference to the outcome he was trying to achieve. His fellow soldiers along the Kola line came to regard him with a mixture of respect and quiet unease that was difficult for some of them to articulate. He was, in every visible way, still the same man who had farmed rye and potatoes near the border before the war began. He ate the same simple rations. He complained no more and no less than anyone else about the cold. Yet there was something in his stillness, in the total absence of hesitation whenever he prepared to go back out into no man's land, that set him apart from men who fought because they had been told to fight. Simo fought the way he had always hunted, without anger, without visible fear, treating each day as a problem to be solved with patience and precision, rather than an ordeal to be endured. But an army with enough shells and enough patience does not need precision to eventually succeed. It only needs enough attempts, thrown at a wide enough area, for one to land where it should not have been possible to land at all. Somewhere in the calculations that Soviet command was making that winter, buried among all the failed ambushes and wasted bombardments and fruitless patrols, one more attempt was already being prepared, and this time distance and luck would matter more than skill, in ways that neither side could yet predict. On the morning of March 6, 1940, Simo took up a position roughly 300 meters from the Soviet line, in a stretch of forest that artillery had already tried and failed to burn clean of him weeks earlier. The temperature hung near 40 below. Light snow drifted down through what remained of the shattered tree line, and visibility ran only a few hundred meters in any direction. He had been in position since before dawn. He had already fired several rounds that morning, each one placed with the same care as the thousands that came before it, and he was preparing to withdraw when a new patrol came into view. This one moved differently than the ones before it. The soldiers advanced carefully, scanning the tree line, checking the ground, behaving less like men on routine patrol and more like men hunting something specific. They were, in fact, doing exactly that. Simo watched them for a long moment before deciding the shot was worth the risk. He fired once. One soldier fell. The rest did not scatter the way most patrols scattered. They dropped into cover and returned fire immediately, in a disciplined volley aimed roughly at the position where his shot had originated, the kind of response that suggested men who had trained specifically for this moment, waiting for exactly this mistake. Simo could not withdraw in time. Rounds struck the snow around him in rapid succession, and in the space of a few seconds, one of them found him. A bullet struck the lower left side of his face, tore through his jaw, and exited the other side, destroying bone and tissue in the passage between. The impact was catastrophic. His jaw was shattered. Several teeth were gone. Blood filled his mouth and throat faster than he could clear it, and for a moment the pain was total enough to erase every other thought his mind might have offered him. But some deeper instinct, built over 34 years of surviving cold and danger and hard labor, refused to let the moment end there. He could not speak. He could not call for help. He could barely draw breath around the blood filling his throat. What remained to him was movement, and so he moved. He began to crawl through the snow toward the Finnish line, dragging himself forward meter by meter, leaving a trail of blood behind him that the pursuing Soviet soldiers could follow as easily as a marked path. They advanced toward that trail, wanting confirmation of what they believed they had finally achieved. For weeks, the Kola sector had haunted their reports and their nerves, and now, perhaps, the White Death himself was crawling wounded through the snow in front of them, close enough to end for good. Finnish soldiers positioned along the defensive line saw what was happening before it was too late. Machine gun crews opened fire on the pursuing Soviets, forcing them back into cover, buying the seconds that a wounded man crawling through deep snow desperately needed. Finnish soldiers moved forward under that covering fire, reached Simo, and pulled him back across the line to safety. He arrived at a Finnish aid station in critical condition. His face was destroyed, his airway was compromised by blood and swollen tissue, and the medics attending him could not intubate through a jaw that no longer held its proper shape. They performed an emergency procedure, cutting an opening into his throat below the damaged area to allow him to breathe at all. It kept him alive long enough to be moved to a field hospital further behind the lines, where surgeons spent hours working to save what they could of a man who, by any reasonable measure, should not have survived the injury at all. The bullet had passed close enough to a major artery that a few millimeters of difference would have ended everything within minutes. It did not. The vessel held. The surgeons closed what wounds they could close, and Simo slipped into a state that hovered somewhere between survival and unconsciousness, unable to speak, unable to eat, fed through a tube while his body attempted to recover from damage that no amount of hunting skill or patience could have prepared him for. He remained in that condition for days, in and out of awareness, while outside the walls of the hospital, the war that had shaped his entire winter was finally reaching its end. On March 12, 1940, negotiators for Finland and the Soviet Union signed the Moscow Peace Treaty, and fighting along the front stopped the following day. Finland ceded roughly a tenth of its territory, including the region near the border where Simo had been born and raised. His family's farm, the land his father had worked before him, now belonged to a country that had spent months trying and failing to kill his son. Finland itself remained independent, a fact that many outside the country had not expected when the invasion began, but the cost of that independence had been steep on both sides. Tens of thousands of Finnish soldiers had died. Soviet losses, according to figures later drawn from Russian military archives, numbered well over 100,000 dead, a staggering toll set against a war most of the world had expected to end in 2 weeks. By the account most often repeated by those who knew him, Simo regained consciousness around the same time the war itself came to its official end, waking into a peace he had not been present for, in a body that would carry the marks of that final morning in the forest for the rest of his life. His jaw would require multiple additional surgeries over the following months. Bone grafts rebuilt what the bullet had destroyed as much as medicine of that era allowed. His face healed into a permanently altered shape, his left cheek visibly sunken, his speech forever changed by damage that no surgery could fully undo. He would never look the way he had looked before that March morning. He was, nonetheless, alive, in a war that had killed men for far less. Finland recognized what he had done, in a way that broke with ordinary military procedure. Simo held the rank of corporal when he was wounded. He was promoted directly to second lieutenant, skipping the ranks in between entirely, an honor personally overseen by Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, the commander of Finland's armed forces. He also received Finland's highest award for wartime service. When asked during the ceremony how he had become such an exceptional marksman, Simo offered an answer that fit everything else about him. "Practice," he said. "Nothing more." He could not return to the farm where he had grown up. That land now belonged to the Soviet Union, under the terms of the treaty his own suffering had helped make possible. His family relocated further west, and the Finnish government provided compensation in the form of new land elsewhere. Simo settled there, built a modest home, and resumed the life he had lived before the war interrupted it. He farmed, he hunted, when his recovery allowed it. He rarely spoke about what had happened along the Kola River, and when people asked, he gave answers that revealed almost nothing beyond the plain facts already known. "I did what was necessary," he told those who pressed him. "Nothing more." The official count credited to him by the end of the war stood at 505 confirmed kills using his rifle alone, a total that remains, to this day, the highest number ever attributed to a sniper in any conflict in modern history. Some accounts suggest an additional number of kills using a submachine gun in closer combat, though those figures are less firmly documented and remain a subject of some dispute among historians. Whatever the precise total, the confirmed number alone was, and remains, without equal. Simo never married. He lived a quiet life for the rest of his years, breeding hunting dogs, working the land, attending occasional gatherings of fellow veterans, and consistently declining most requests for interviews about the war that had made his name known across the world. When journalists did occasionally reach him, his answers stayed brief and unadorned. "It was my duty," he said once. "I fulfilled it, that is all." In 1998, at the age of 93, he agreed to one recorded conversation with a Finnish historian. Asked whether he felt any regret over the number of men he had killed, Simo answered slowly, choosing his words with the same care he had once used choosing a position in the snow. "I regret that the war happened," he said. "I regret that men died, but I do not regret what I did. Soviet soldiers invaded my country. They would have killed Finns if I had not stopped them. That was my duty." Asked if he considered himself a hero, he shook his head. "No," he said. "I was a soldier. I followed orders. Heroes are the men who gave everything and did not come home. I survived. I am only a farmer who learned to shoot." Simo Häyhä died on April 1, 2002, at the age of 96, in a veterans' care home in the town of Hamina. He had lived 62 years past the morning a bullet nearly ended his life in the snow near Kola. He had outlived the nation that once sent an army to hunt him. His funeral drew veterans, officials, and ordinary citizens who wished to pay respect to a man who had never sought it for himself. He was buried beneath a simple headstone bearing his name, his dates, and a single word beneath them: soldier. His rifle survived the war as well, passed on to other hands after he was wounded, eventually retired from service and placed in the Finnish Military Museum in Helsinki, where it remains today, an ordinary-looking weapon that achieved results no one who first held it could have predicted. It carries no ornamentation, no modification, nothing to suggest the history attached to it. It looks like what it always was in Simo's hands, a simple tool, used with extraordinary discipline by a man who never wanted to be remembered as anything more than what he was: a farmer, a soldier, a man who did what was necessary and lived the rest of his life trying quietly to leave that necessity behind him.